Hey guys, before I get to reading this, I kind of wanted to tell you a little bit what it is, and if you don't care and you just want to hear it, I'll put a button on the screen that you can click to skip this. I'll try to keep it short though. Anyway, this is another one of my personal fiction stories, and if you check in my channel, uh, around the time I started my channel, I actually did a reading for this. I only did the first chapter. But in all honesty, I've been working on this story since I was like 16. So it doesn't start out very well. And I rewrote it because I wanted to read it, but I didn't like the beginning, so I've rewritten the beginning parts. Now there's a lot to the story because I've been writing this for years, and there will definitely be a lot of installments if I continue to make these videos, and this is just the prologue to it. But this is sort of like my other story of my own fiction that I read, and I'll still do that, but I just want to do this as well. This one isn't as mature, and it's a fantasy, not a supernatural story. It's like a medieval fantasy, elves and dwarves and magic and stuff like that, dragons. So if you're into that, then it would be awesome if you'd listen to this story. But if you're not into fantasy stuff, then your decision. It's going to be, or it is, it's not going to be, it is a romantic adventure because I can't do anything without romance in it. It's just the hard truth of my personality. But anyway, guys, that's just basically what this is about. If there's really not that much mature stuff in it, but if there's anything a little mature, I'll put a warning at the beginning. But this should be mostly good for everybody. You shouldn't be uncomfortable listening to me read this. But anyway, I will start the story now. One of my greatest friends once taught me a valuable lesson about leadership. He said, "A good leader is a flawed one. They do not radiate perfection. That is intimidating. No, they show that they are just as their subjects, that they are one and the same. A leader understands where they are coming from, whether she a general or a princess. She gets the desperations of those below her. She will not pretend to know everything, whether it be what's best for her or for her people. A leader must be the voice of her people. She must understand what they want, and while she will never be able to appease them all, they trust your judgment. Never shall she force her will upon her people to disregard what they feel. She must care for each and every soul under her command, and know that they all matter equally. A good leader would lay down her life for the lowest commoner in her keep. It's okay to be vulnerable, to rely on those closest to her. The stress of perfection is too much otherwise. Understand your weakness and understand that is what makes you a good leader." Perhaps these words are meaningless if the plight of my country is unknown. Maybe our story should be best told from the point of view of one of my companions. Or maybe the whole fable is best seen from my eyes, the words scribed by my hand. I do not know for sure. I do know that I am the one who has volunteered to tell the tale, however, and maybe that is for the best. I do in fact know both sides of the spectrum, and by retelling them, it will be easy to understand why we did as we did. It all started and ended with me, after all. 19 years prior to the beginning of this story, I was born Princess Amani Boleyn, to King Marthas and Abiana Boleyn, the rulers of Avis, a large country housed inside the continent of Babylonia. My family had ruled the country for 15 generations spanning roughly 8 centuries. And for all those hundreds of years, the Boleyns had produced their fair share of questionable kings and queens. But we had also given rise to many fair and just monarchs as well. In recent years, however, those of the tyrannical kind had sat their butts on the throne. The kingdom was ruled from the mountain city of Marenhall, the capital city of Avis, and of course home to the royal palace. I had never left the city, precedent to my tale, and neither had my older brother Akin. We lived sheltered, controlled lives. What else was expected of the children of His Majesty? The heir to the throne and the precious bargaining chip and marital deals were to be protected. But I find it more essential to speak of my father than myself. As a girl, I looked up to him as a protective, loving caretaker, but as I grew, his true light began to unfold before my eyes. He was ruthless, careless, and lacked 1 ounce of mercy. Favoring the rich, he crushed the poor, forcing them into slums of which living conditions were horrid and food was scarce. Anyone who spoke out against him was slaughtered. Their bodies hung in the gallows for all to see, to make an example. When larger resistances rose, his armies were sent to cast them back down. Women in his kingdom were treated as possessions of the men. While the reform began with his grandfather, my father had went to great lengths to harshen the laws towards us. We were outlawed to learn combat skill, or any other skills that would help us to revolt. We were meant only to be commanded, and though I was a princess and waited on as such, I was still to do my father's bidding without question. There was no denying his will and that of any other man's. However, I do not despise men. I only hate the man who made it law. Then there was the treatment of the mages. In general, they controlled energies that were unobtainable to normal people. They were magic. They willed the forces of nature and spirit, energy and thought, everything. My father feared them. I'm not quite sure where that stemmed from. Whether it was the fact that they controlled sheer energy at their fingertips, or that he was envious of their abilities, I was unsure. That sort of fear was palpable, however, intense. His fear led to the inquisition of the kind. Anyone who showed signs of magic were bound with suppressive cuffs and sent to a compound in the nearest city. There they were used as slaves and housed in small rooms filled with many other mages. Marenhall was home to the largest of these compounds. This was where they kept the most powerful of the mages, the ones my father feared the most. If they were to make a single move to threaten the Elf King's rule, they would be executed in a public display. Keep your enemies closer, right? We were elves. The divided race that we were, we had all the opportunities. A fraction of our kind was a naturalist who lived in houses built high up in the trees. The woodland elves were one with nature, hunting and living off the land. The two sects were at odds with each other, and while we tried to stay separate, those in the bounds of the country had to live under the law of the king. The rest of us lived in the cities, like Marenhall. City elves were usually privileged in their station. We made most of the nobility of the country, and while obviously not every city elf was rich, they were usually more fortunate than the other races. Avis was home to the majority of our kind, but in truth the humans still outnumbered us. The humans had once conquered most of Babylonia in a whole, but long, long ago a rebellion had taken the control of Avis from human royalty, placing the rule of the country on the heads of my family. It had been that way ever since. Humans were more separated in their beliefs, but more willing to work together despite their differences. Because of that, they were of the greatest threat and were meant to be kept down. None were meant to get any ideas and rise up against their elven overlords. Humans lived more commonly in slums and cities. or rather in smaller villages or towns further from the capital. The few who had managed to work their way to nobility were usually ostracized and treated differently among their peers. Humans were generally stronger and larger than elves, so they made the majority of the army, guard, and knight order. Even still, my father went to great lengths to assure they were to be kept in their place. My father had carefully thrown the country into a state to which his rule would not be questioned. I admit it was a smart play. He overdid it, however, and that kind of tyranny would not be handled with a grain of salt forever. It is hard for me to decide where to start with my tale. I am not sure what place in my life prequel to my adventure is a perfect area to initiate. I do know that I was docile for as long as possible. I kept my rebellious spirit to a minimum, at least in public. However, in such a short time, everything went crashing down on top of me. The downfall began with a few occurrences, so that is where I will begin as well.